Hi guys, tonight I wanted to talk to you a little bit about dyeing your calf. And stick with me, if you've ever had any trouble dyeing a calf that has a little white on their legs, which this one doesn't, but we're going to talk about, he actually has like a little patch there. If you ever had trouble with burning calves while you're dyeing them, or dyeing cattle that have white legs, we're going to cover a few things that can help with that tonight. So first things first, I like to kind of prepare the calf. We usually just rinse them, dry them, they're ready to go where we can start dyeing them. Couple things, I don't really like to wash them with like shampoo. Sometimes there's perfumes in those shampoos, and I think that it can react to, the dye can react to some of them perfumes in those shampoos. So I just like kind of a clean slate. We rinse them, dry them, get them clean. Before we start anything, I like to come through and kind of identify some sensitive areas that sometimes will burn. Right here around this tail head, kind of around their butt and their twist here, sometimes maybe in their chest floors or their sheath. We'll just come in here and we're real precise with it, but I like to come in here, and especially like if this steer had a shaved tail, we'd come in here and put a little Pro Charge on there. It's got a little oil to it. It's going to help keep that dye from actually sticking to the hide. And so we're just going to put it right on there. Just kind of wipe it in a little bit. Try not to get it on the areas that we want to dye, because then obviously that dye is not going to stick. The other thing I like to do is I like to tape an ear tag. So we've got obviously here a white ear tag that's going to be covered in dye if we don't do anything to it. So we're going to come up here. I just take a little duct tape. We're going to come in here and just cover this tag. We're going to put a few wraps there and just cover that so it doesn't get all covered in dye. And do that real quick. Maybe put one on the back here. It doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to cover it. Put one here, because as we're applying that dye, inevitably it's going to get up there on that tag. Now, a couple things I want to cover before we actually get too far into this. You might ask why we dye a calf. Really, the reason that we like to dye all black ones. If you'll zoom in here, Taylor, you can see they get this kind of brown tinges, and do the best you can. I know it's all black, but if you can see it good there. They sometimes, in certain times of the year, black cattle will get just a little tinge to it, and it almost makes their hair just look a little dull. And so on these black ones, we like to come back in and just get them jet black. And in fact, even if they already are jet black, that dye really brings it to life. It gives it a little shine. If it's got a little deadness to it, like it's starting to die, it'll just bring it all back to life. It'll make it all look a little bit more uniform. So that's really why we like to dye these things. One other thing I like to do when I'm dyeing a calf is I like to put a tail clamp on them. Some of them like it, some of them don't. But all this is it's got a little pressure point in there. I don't know if you can see that too. And it just puts a little pressure on that calf's tail and keeps them from swinging that tail. When you put this on, make sure you get it high enough on their tail. If you get it down here, they can swing this and it'll turn into a weapon. So get it right up here, up high, and it'll keep them from wanting to really swing their tail. Because what happens is when we get this thing fully dyed, he's going to have, this tail is going to be dyed and he's going to be slinging it in your face. Now they may still move it a little, but one that moves their tail, we like this for clipping too. It works really well. But again, I just like to keep that a little bit more immobilized. Now, I talked about dyeing one that had a little white on them. So a lot of times cattle will have dye here on their back leg. A lot of them have it in their flanks now. And so what I like to do, I'm just going to pretend, let's say that this flank is all white. So what I like to do is I'm going to take a little Pro Gloss, I'm going to put it on there, I'm going to coat that area real good, get a little bit of this oil on there so if the dye gets to it, it doesn't stick as well. And then I like to come back and I'm going to grab a little bit of Pro Foam And I'm going to come in here, and where that white is, I'm just going to coat it. I'm going to coat it up real good. So this works really well on like semitals that have these white flanks, and we want to dye them. So now we've created, and you can zoom in here, Taylor, and see this flank. So we've created a barrier. If we get any dye on that, it's going to be on this foam. It's not going to be on that hair. So we got a layer of Pro Gloss, then we come in, put a layer of foam. And so when we go to applying this dye, it's going to keep it from getting to that white hair, because we don't want to change their actual color pattern. If they got some white in them, like right here, I didn't want to dye this, but this one's got a little white on his leg there. We're actually just going to put a little bit of oil there, come back, put a little shot of foam, and then we can go ahead and come back and we can dye without having to worry about getting it on those white spots. So I'm going to come back here. There's two different ways we can dye one. We can put it in a spray bottle like this. I'll just hold these up. We can put it in a spray bottle like this or a foamer like this and apply it with a blower. We've done it both ways. I'll tell you, when we're dyeing sale cattle and we're doing, you know, maybe 10, 15, 20 at a time, we might do it with this. When we're just doing like one big fat steer or a couple big fat steers or something like that, for instance, this one right here, we're probably going to just do this. I feel like I have a little bit more control over how I apply it, where I apply it, and how much I put on. When we have the blower hose hooked up to this one, you're putting it on and it's going everywhere. The other thing, well, I'm mentioning it, is we like to take our cattle outside. So tonight, just for lighting purposes and stuff, we got them on the wash rack. But a lot of times we'll find like an old gate. If you just want to swing around there, Taylor, we might just find an old gate to dye one on, because you're going to have dye on places where you don't want it. It's going to be slung up there on the front, and that's not going to come off real easy. So that's the other reason I like to use this spray bottle to apply it, is we just got a little bit more control. Now, when we apply this dye, what I like to do first and foremost, before I ever start applying it, is I like to get all this stuff done. I like to get my dye mix, and I'm going to go over that just real quick. But I like to set a timer. As soon as I start putting that dye on, I grab my iPhone, put 20 minutes on the stopwatch, and I like to just set that timer, because what happens is, if we start dyeing this calf and it takes us 5 to 10 minutes to dye it, and then we start our timer at 20 minutes, we've actually gotten out to 25 or 30 minutes. And I also think that's where we start to see some burning and stuff, is because we're leaving it on probably a little longer than we need to. I've had really, really good luck leaving it on for 20 minutes. And when we're doing sale cattle, sometimes we'll even bump it down a little bit, but 20 minutes is really good. The other thing I'll tell you while we're on kind of the time is, I really like to have that calf back on the wash rack when that timer goes off, and start rinsing it. So from the time it stops to the time you start dyeing to the time that timer goes off, I like to be really precise with that. I don't like to go over too far with that. So real quick, I like to apply, and usually I'm going to find like an old comb that either got broken or stepped on, because all this stuff is going to be pretty well ruined when we're done. Not ruined, but we have a couple combs that we use for dyeing, and they're not our best comb, is my point, because they're going to turn black, they're going to have a little buildup on them. So we try and find an older comb, an older scrub brush. I really like the scrub brush, because as I'm putting this on, that dye, and I'm not actually going to do this calf tonight, but as I'm putting this on, I like to come in here and I like to comb on that calf as we're putting it on. But I like to come back with this scrub brush, and I like to, because it's got just quite a bit more bristle to it, I like to come in here, and it just separates that hair out a little bit, where we get full, even coverage on that entire calf.
Do you use that comb after you've dyed the whole calf and then you come back with that comb, or do you do it as you're going?
Kind of either or. So a lot of times what I do is I'll use this comb and dye the whole calf, just make sure that I have it everywhere I want it, and then I'm going to come back, set my bottle down, and I might even go down with that hair, then go forward with that hair. The one thing I will tell you is a lot of times you'll see people put dye on, and I've done this too, and we just put it on there real quick, and then it spends 20 minutes kind of drying in the wrong direction. So when you get done, even if you want to part that top and tail head, make sure all that hair's drying back in the direction you want it to. And that's another good point is we might dye outside and actually apply it outside, but don't let your calf just sit there and bake in the sun. I think that's another place we see some burning issues, is that I like to get them back in the shade, either put them under fans or just have them where they're not in the direct sunlight. That sunlight has a tendency to just really bake that dye onto the hair and hide. And that's really where we see a lot of the burning is more in the summertime. I think it's for two reasons. It's a little warmer out, the sun's a little more intense, and our hair in the summer is generally a little thinner, and so that dye, it's allowing that dye to sit down on that hide a little better. So really good question there. Now, kind of wrap things up. When I start rinsing one, and we talked about, you see how we have that foam down there, I like to start rinsing up high, and I like to rinse all this out of them. But I like to leave these spots where they're white, where we've covered that with foam, till last, because what's going to happen is we're going to have this dye running out of this calf, and it's going to run right over that foam. And so I'll rinse the entire calf, and then I'll come back and rinse those white spots to make sure, because if what happens is if we come in here and we like, I want to make sure I didn't dye that white in her belly, and I come in here and rinse that off, it's going to take all of your protection away. You come back up here and you're running dye back into that flank. So start up high, rinse all your black spots, leave your white colored parts for later. Again, when we get done, one thing that I think is super important, and where I think cattle do get burned is, and I think I'm guilty of it, and I have, we get in a hurry and we rinse this out, and again, I don't always wash them. I'll just rinse it out really, really good. And I might wash them the next day. But when I get done rinsing that dye out, I take this and I flip it over, and I'm just going to check my work. You can squeegee that out, and if that water is running clear, you've got it all out. What happens a lot of times is we can sit here with that water hose, and you're rinsing and rinsing and rinsing, and it looks like it's coming clean. You pick up your comb and you go to squeegee that water out like we do sometimes, and it'll run almost just looks brown or black like that water, and we haven't got all that dye out. And what happens is, I think, is if we don't get all that dye out, it just sits there until the next time we wash them. And so that's another reason I think sometimes we can get some burning. So make sure we spend a lot of time rinsing, using this as a squeegee, and getting that dye out. Question?
Marco wants to know if you ever dye around the head or neck.
Okay, that's a good question. So the place where I usually dye it, and I'm going to preface all this with, I usually dye one when they're just about done being clipped. Because what happens is, you can see this one's pretty hairy. He hasn't been clipped in probably 3 months, 4 months. I like to clip them, and about a day or two before we go to the show is when we actually dye them. Because what happens is, if I dyed this calf right now, and then I come back in here and I clip him, I clip his top, we're going to expose a little bit more red. So we like that to be one of the last things we do, is clip them and then dye them. As far as the head and neck, and I say all that to say this, once we get done clipping this head and neck, if it looks pretty black to me and we've got it fairly tight, I'm probably not going to put a bunch of dye up here on their head and neck. Now, if it's pretty dingy and brown looking, I'm going to dye it. And what I'm going to do up there is I might even switch over, and I don't have one right here with me, but I might even switch over to something that has a little bit more bristle to it, and I might come in here and really work it into that, because it's harder to dye when we've got cattle that don't have as much hair. And when we clip this head and neck down, it's going to be a little bit harder for that hair to stick. Now, as far as their head, I usually don't do around their head and their eyes. I think we need to be careful around their eyes. I do their ears sometimes. Their ears, quite often, you can have one that's jet black, and they've got so much hair on these ears, and this one's got a little, but that hair on their ears will get really brown, and I always leave their ears real fluffy. And so I like to dye those if they are brown. Again, we don't have to get into the ear, we don't have to get down to the hide. We're just trying to get the hair on the surface there where it's really jet black. So again, just come back in here, make sure when you're done, get all that dye out of them. Once we get the dye out of them, we're going to dry this calf. That's when I like to come back and put a really good coat of like a Pro Charge or some kind of Pro Conditioner. What happens is when you put that dye on that hair and hide, it can dry it out just a little. And to keep them from burning, we're going to come back in here and we're going to put just a shot of moisturizer back in those calves. One final thought before I let y'all go, and please feel free to comment any questions you might have. Oh, you got a question?
Yeah, Jim, can you go over again, a spray bottle or a fogger?
A fogger, yes. So these are our two options. This is the fogger, this is the spray bottle. When we're doing multiple head and we're going quick and like sale cattle and we got a bunch of them to do, I'll use the fogger. It's a little less efficient, but it's effective. You can put it on there. You're probably going to waste a little bit of dye. When I'm doing one and I'm being real particular, especially if I'm doing one that's got a little white on them, I like to use this spray bottle. What it's going to do is just give you a little bit more control. It's not as quick, but it'll give you a little bit more control as to where you're putting that on that calf if you're trying to keep it away from a certain area. I probably use this 90% of the time.
Richard wants to know what dye you recommend.
Okay.
And were you going to go over mixing it?
So yes, I do want to go over this real quick. So in this, we love this Pro hair or Pro dye.
This next question will also go along with what you're talking about. Sorry,
Okay.
Quentin wants to know how long it will last. I'm guessing like the bottle of dye.
Well, I think and just write in the comments, are you asking how long it's going to stick to their hair and hide and how long that's going to last?
Maybe that was it.
I'm guessing that's what it is. But you'll see we've got actual black dye here. Then we've got the activator. So just real quick, what I like to tell people is this box right here, and I'm not even sure what this retails for, but it's like 25, 30 bucks for a box, and it would probably do 1.5 this size. It'll do a full fat steer, a big bred heifer. But if you're doing a baby calf, just make sure you keep this ratio the same. So if you're gonna use half this box, don't use 3 of the activator and 2 of the black. Just go and use half of that box right there. Does that make sense? So back to his question on how long it lasts.
On the animal,
On
he
the animal?
clarified.
Okay. So a lot of times we'll do it, like on a fat steer right before they go into the show. So there's obviously no problem on how long that's going to last, because it only needs to last 4, 5, 6 days. When we're jackpotting in the wintertime, we might dye one and we might be good for a month. We might, if we're going every weekend, we might redo it after a month just to make sure we got good coverage. What happens more than likely is it's going to hold really well, and that's why I love this dye, is it lasts a long time. But what happens is you might have to come in and do a touch-up, because over a month time we're going to clip this top down 3 or 4 times if we're showing every weekend. So you might have to come back in here and touch up a few areas, but you might not have to necessarily do the whole calf. But really, until that calf starts shucking out or it starts dying and that hair cycle starts changing, that's when you start seeing where the dye starts wearing off. But you could get, say you're showing every weekend, you might get 3, 4 shows out of this, 3, 4 weekends out of this dye job.
So back to the dye, Marco wants to know, are you using those 2 by itself, or are you also diluting it with something else, or water?
That's a really good question, and I think that's another place where we see some burning is. When I mix this up, I'm going to open this bottle, I'm going to mix this up, and again, we haven't done this for demonstration purposes. We're not going to dye this calf. In fact, we don't want to dye it because we're still trying to grow hair. It's going to be a while before he shows. But I'm going to take a clean, empty bottle that's never had anything in it. If it has had something in it, make sure that you rinse it out really good. If it's just been sheen, you're probably fine. But I would recommend a fresh bottle, because if we've had Pro Charge or conditioner in here, it's going to lessen the effects of this dye. But when I'm putting this in here, I'm going to put all dye. I'm not going to water it down with water. I'm not going to use sheen. I know that used to be a practice to even use like Dawn detergent soap back in the day when we were using some other products. Just put the dye in there and let the dye do do the work. This right here will fill this. It's a quart. It ends up being a quart. It'll fill this entire bottle, and this bottle will do this calf plus probably a half of another one, but for sure we'll do one full calf. The other thing I like is, and this is important, when I'm dying, I have the oldest clothes on that I can find, because it is going to be everywhere. In fact, I will even take and put just a little bit of oil, this Pro Gloss. I'll put it on my arms a little bit. I might even put it around my neck, because you're inevitably going to have a little bit of splatter spots on you. The other thing that the Pro Dye has is it comes with a package of these rubber gloves, and I really recommend utilizing those from the get. When you start mixing the dye, you're gonna get it on your hands, and it's not gonna come off for a week or two. And that kind of goes back to your question on how long it lasts. Literally, if I open one of these up and dabbed it on my hand, it's gonna be here for a few days, if not longer, because it's gonna stick quick. And the other thing is, our hands get dry and it gets down in those cracks and it really doesn't come out. So I always use those gloves, because the last thing you kind of want is to be in the show ring with your hands just covered in dye, and it can happen. So the other thing I'll do is I'll put those gloves on, and then I might wear a long sleeve shirt, or even I've used like AI gloves, put an AI sleeve on and put a rubber band up here, so you kind of cover yourself. But again, you don't want your best jeans on, you don't want your best hat on, because it is going to be, you're going to have it on your clothes, and it's not going to come out of your clothes. It's going to, I mean, it's designed to stay, and so it will stain your clothes. Any other questions you have? So I'm going to wrap things up. Again, we talked about conditioning these cattle once we've dyed them. The other thing I'll tell you is, if you've got, say you've got a Simmental heifer that you just dyed, but you got a Hereford heifer that she eats with at night, give that a couple nights before you go kick her out in with your Hereford heifer, because, or any colored heifer. But what will happen is, inevitably at the bunk, that other colored heifer is going to rub up against it, and if there's any dye left whatsoever, if there's just a little bit of residue, it's going to end up on your other heifer. And obviously I found that out the hard way. So I would just recommend, for sure, for the first night, until you come back and wash them the next day, make sure you kick them out into their own run. Just let them have their own space for one night. So if you have any questions, again, hit us up in the comments. We're doing some new stuff on Instagram and Snapchat, at John Gev and at John Gevlinger. Feel free to reach out, shoot us a question if you ever have anything. You can direct message us, private message us. We get messages every day, and we try to answer them that same day. So thanks for joining us.